Hello, everybody. Happy Monday. It is October 20th, and welcome to Growing Good Humans podcast. My name is Laura Barr. I'm the owner and founder of Emerging Educational Consulting. We provide one-to-one mentorship from the beginning to end of the college application process for parents and students. And what better way to provide information and to grow good humans than to sit here today with Bill Huston, who is one of the founders of Mindfish Test Prep. Ryan was with us a couple years ago, but he's not here today. But both of you have created an incredible empire of test prep that I think of all the people that I know in the field who do this are really rooted in that philosophy of raising good humans and using those test scores to elevate the story of the narrative and also to use the test wisely. So I don't even know where to begin in this conversation. I mean, the last time, so much has changed in test prep. I mean, COVID really, actually, the COVID and the test optional has just rocked the entire college consulting, college acceptance, college everything. And I'd love to just hear your I mean, first of all, you could introduce yourself. I should give you a chance, but I'm so excited to dive in. I'm like, what is happening with test prep? Should we do it? Should we not do it? Should we report? Should we not? Should we go test optional? Like, there's the thousands of questions I want to ask in 30 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Laura. Great to see you again. Great to be here with you all today. Yeah, I'm Bill Huston from Mindfish. We've been partnering with Laura for quite a while. We've worked with many of her students at Immersion Consulting over the years on all things test preparation. We also do academic tutoring and all this kind of stuff as well. But yes, it's an interesting time for the tests, Laura, for sure. And the way you phrased it is, how can you manage this process? How can you navigate this testosterone landscape to your benefit? I think there are a lot of questions, and we'll get into a lot of the details about testing policy and testing strategy and all of this good stuff. But long story short, the fact that the testing landscape has shifted over the last few years makes it more flexible for students. It allows us to engage with the tests in a meaningful way if that's going to be an important part of this process for you or your students. And it allows us to have more flexibility around what that looks like. Pre-COVID, up through the end of 2019, these tests were just kind of a known quantity. Everyone took them. Every college in the country required them for the most part. There are some exceptions. Test optional started before COVID, but it really kind of became the norm during COVID. But for the most part, any school in the country, any college or university in the United States required the tests pre-COVID. And that's no longer the case. Right now, what I would say is the majority of schools in the country are what we call test optional. And we're going to talk about what that means in a minute. One thing I want to say up front, though, is that contrary to what you've heard maybe in the news over the last few years, the tests haven't just like poof gone away. They are still a part of the college landscape. Unfortunately, they're freighted with a little more confusion and complexity than they used to be. But it does, I think, present an opportunity to you as a student or you as a family to use these tests in the most advantageous way for yourself. So it's more complicated. People have more questions than they used to. But I think we're in a world now where these tests can be used in a more advantageous way for each and every student if you're thoughtful about what that might look like.
Yep, that seems about right. Let's just talk about SAT, ACT. Is there one a student should take over another, and how do you assess that in a student's story?
Absolutely. So SAT and ACT in the eyes of admissions departments these days are very much equal. Meaning any admissions department in the country will accept the SAT or the ACT equally without bias or preference for either test. Um, I took these tests in a beautiful and bygone era called the 1990s, and that was not the case in the 1990s. If you took the test back then, you may remember that there were some geographic disparities. namely the East Coast was really SAT territory back in the day. Um, the ACT was very popular in the greater Midwest. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. The ACT was kind of the default test for most of my friends. I wanted to go to schools on the East Coast, and I wanted to at least like consider schools on the East Coast. So I ended up taking both tests because there was a geographic disparity. Fast forward to today, 2025, the tests are very much equal. There's no preference at any school around the country. If they look at tests, they will look at SAT and ACT the same. So what that means is, as I kind of hinted at as a general theme a minute ago, that gives you as a student more flexibility. So what we do at my company Mindfish, and what I know we do with a lot of your students, Laura, is we'll have students take a diagnostic test of both types. We'll have them do one SAT and one ACT, and we'll compare and contrast the results. There may be one test that a student is better at. There may be one test that a student prefers, or dislikes less, maybe. And we can play to that strength. There's no reason you have to feel obligated to take either one. Um, I will say SAT is still kind of the more widely known test. More parents, probably because parents are essentially my age these days, parents of high school students, um, are familiar with the SAT, but the ACT is taken by as many students nationally as the SAT is every year. And again, colleges look at it in the same way. So we have all of our students try one of each in a practice setting, a no stakes diagnostic setting, and then we sit down and try to determine which one's the better fit, which one is a student more comfortable with, and then we'll move forward with either one.
What are the differences? And also, can you speak to digital learning? I mean, digital test taking, I guess digital
Yeah.
learning also. And then um, what how does a family decide, especially if they say there's dyslexia involved or
Mm.
HD or how accommodations? I mean, I know I'm actually asking a lot of questions, but I think the digital testing has upset a lot of neurodiverse um, families and
Mm.
students. And then there's just the question of what's the difference between the SAT and ACT? And so, how does someone decide which one they're going to take? Now, I get that you're saying take one, take the other, and then decide.
Yeah.
But even on the front end, is there guidance on that?
Um, I mean, there are some generalizations we can make, and I can pull up some slides here to show you some stuff in a second. There are generalizations we can make about which test might be a better fit for kind of what type of students. But at the end of the day, I do think it's a very individualized process. Some students are strongly better at either the SAT or the ACT, one or the other, and it doesn't always match up with what our generalizations or what our expectations might be. Um, I think that's especially true with neurodiverse students, honestly. I know through Emerging, you work with quite a few neurodiverse students. At my company, Mindfish, we work with quite a few neurodiverse students as well. Sometimes they overlap. And some of our neurodiverse kids are much better at the SAT. Some of our neurodiverse kids are much better at the ACT. I'll talk about some differences in a second. But you kind of highlighted one of the biggest differences, Laura, which is digital versus paper and pencil. Um, Now, there's some complexity, so I'm going to gloss over it a little bit because we could do a 90-minute podcast like just on SAT versus ACT, honestly, but I'll get into some of the detail. SAT now is a digital test. Starting in 2024 in the US, the SAT is fully digital. Um, with an asterisk, if you have certain accommodations or a neurodiverse profile of a very specific type, you can still take the SAT in a paper and pencil format. I might be misremembering, but I don't think we've had any students at Mindfish do that in the last year and a half,
Mhm.
um, which is quite a few hundred students. I've like really never seen that. So for all intents and purposes, the SAT is a digital test. The ACT, not to get too complex, but the ACT you can take either digitally or as a paper and pencil test right now. With that being said, I very much consider the ACT to be a paper and pencil test still, because we are not advising students to take the ACT digitally at this time. Um,
Mm.
we could go down the rabbit hole on that a little bit, but the ACT's digital platform is still quite new. Not that many people have taken it. Frankly, it's a little bit unstable in my opinion. So we're basically looking at SAT digital, ACT, paper, and pencil. One additional footnote with that, if you are an international student, if you're testing outside of the US, you will take the ACT digitally. So what I'm saying right now is not relevant to students who take the test outside of the United States. But for our domestic kids, ACT, paper and pencil, SAT digital. Now, that's the biggest difference by far between these two tests. Depending on who you are, and to go back to the topic of neurodiversity, one or the other may be a better fit for you. For example, to get into some more detail about the test, this digital SAT is a shorter test overall, which features more time per each question. And on the reading sections, has much shorter reading passages than does the ACT, right?
Mm.
On the flip side of all of those points, ACT is longer, it's faster or more quickly moving, there's less time per question, and the reading passages are a good deal longer. Now, as you might be able to imagine, given that description, for some students, specifically some students who maybe have attention deficit dynamics or neurodivergences in that realm, that digital SAT can be a really good fit because it's shorter, because there's more time per question, because the reading passages are not nearly as long. So again, take this with a grain of salt, but a lot of our kids with ADHD do prefer that digital SAT format. Now, if we flip that, some other students very much prefer the paper ACT. And it honestly can also be other students with attention neurodiversity, like attention deficit neurodiversity. Um, One example of that is on the digital SAT, you're doing it all on a screen, right? Well, now envision that you're taking a math section and you might, and in my opinion, you should do some math work on your scratch paper on your desk in front of you. So what you're doing is actually reading it on a screen, writing that question down on your paper, doing
Mm.
your work there, and then basically transcribing your work from the paper back to the computer. For some kids, that's a perfectly fine and comfortable process. For other students, specifically some students with specific neurodiversities or even ADHD, for example, that gap between paper and screen can be hard to bridge, right? So that's a lengthy example, but even for kids with like the same essentially manifestations of neurodiversity, one test may be better or worse depending on who they are. And I said I was going to share a slide here. I've got hold on a second. I need to.
While you do that, let me just kind of
Yeah.
summarize. I think what I hear you saying, which really resonates, is this whole idea of like, if we're really going, if a student is going to engage in the test taking,
Mm,
then really paying attention and looking at this the student in front of you, which is one of our
yes.
huge values, is to take the
Mhm.
time, because we can use it if students want to. They can use it to their advantage or not, depending on the output
Right.
and input. But in the end, it's so dependent on the student, which is why having some kind of mentorship through making
Yes.
that decision feels really important. It also is such a huge investment in time. I know sometimes when I'm working with students, I feel like, if they're starting off with a score that's on the lower side, and I know the investment it's going to take for them to bring it up, even though I believe they could. And especially
Mm.
with Mindfish there, I'm like, I know we could do it, but it's like, how much time do we really want to put into this? And I mean, go ahead and show the slides if you figure out a way to do it. If you didn't, we can just keep chatting about this.
Yeah. Let me see if I can do this here real quick. Yeah. So I this is just another answer to your question a second ago. Can you see the slide, Laura?
Yeah, it's great.
Awesome. Who should take the SAT? Notice that one of my points here, the bottom bullet says some test takers with accommodations. Two slides later, it says the same thing on the ACT, some test takers with accommodations. So it really depends on who you are as a thinker, who you are as a student. There are some generalizations, but it's it can vary from student to student. I mentioned some of these things. If you like a digital test, SAT might be a good fit. If you like shorter reading passages, SAT might be a good fit. Here in Colorado, where I am right now, for instance, a lot of our public school students are essentially mandated to take the SAT in school. So that could be a good fit for those students. But as you're kind of suggesting, Laura, I really urge each student to try both, talk to someone about the results, at least just try both and think about it. You may hate one and you might like the other one a lot better. And that in itself is a good indication of which way to go.
Is there just a reason right off the bat that someone just don't bother to take the test?
Well, you started to suggest this a second ago. And one thing I love about what you all do at Emerging and what we also try to do at Mindfish is this is a very personalized process. This is a very thoughtful and intentional process for each student. And therefore, it can look different for every student. I mean, I know you work with a lot of students every year at Emerging. The process for one kid and the process for another kid can be very, very different, right? What's good advice for the first kid may be really bad advice for the second student, right? And so that's something I really appreciate about what you all do, and again, what we try to do. And so, yeah, there are students where if we have them do some diagnostics and we sit down, well, we'll be very honest and say, look, I don't know if testing needs to be a big part or any part of your college admissions process. And what that often relates to is how the goals of that student and their initial starting scores play with the student's overall profile.
Mm-hmm.
And I said at the beginning that we would talk more about test optional, and I'd like to do that in a minute. But for now, just let's start with the assumption that you can test if you want to, but you're not obligated to test if you decide not to. Um, if you're a student who has exceptional grades, right, takes really hard classes and does really well in school, has perfect GPA, great leadership, inspiring extracurricular activities, great essays, everything looks really good, and your test scores just aren't at that same level, you may be a student who doesn't test or doesn't focus that much on testing, right? Because the rest of your college profile is so strong that the testing on balance might like bring it down a little bit, right? And there's a gray area. This doesn't need to be all or nothing. And we'll talk about that in a second vis-a-vis test optional. But if the tests are not at the high bar that you've set for yourself in all other aspects of your high school life, then maybe you don't focus on testing, right? On the other hand, if you're a student with lower grades, not super engaged, but for whatever reason you can go in and post a great score on the SAT like right away, you're someone who probably should focus on this a little bit and put some energy behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So it really depends on where the student is coming from and what the goal is. And we're very honest with people about that. I mean, if testing really shouldn't be a part of the process, then we will tell you that. With that being said, I think for most students, they should at least like explore testing, how much time they devote to it, whether it's a priority in this process, those are different questions, but usually it's not worth ruling out from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to, I'll use that as a segue to go back to this topic of test optional that we've danced around a little bit. So test optional is kind of what it sounds like, right? You can take the test if you choose. You can submit the scores if you choose to the colleges to which you're applying. Um, but you're not required to test. You're not required to submit the scores. The bulk of the colleges and universities in the U.S., like more than 90% of them, are test optional. They follow that optional policy. There are some schools in the country that are what we call test free. Most notable example of that is the University of California system. Early on in COVID, the UC schools went test free. So UC Berkeley, UCLA, UC Davis, anything with a UC in front of it, as well as the California state system, don't look at tests. You cannot submit your scores. They do not have a way to look at them. Now, that's a small cohort of schools. The UCs are the biggest, most prominent example, but there are, I think, something like 80 schools in the country that are test free. Then the vast middle, like couple thousand schools, are test optional. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have some schools that are test required. Again, it's not a ton. I haven't looked like today, and it's kind of a moving target, but I think there are 50 or maybe 60 test required schools in the country. And these are schools that either never went to test optional during COVID. Great example there is the University of Florida system. It never went test optional. or there are schools that went to test optional during the pandemic and then flipped back. State schools in Tennessee and Georgia are test required again. There are a lot of STEM focused colleges around the country that require tests, like Purdue, MIT, Caltech. And then there are like the Ivy type schools, the Stanfords of the world, that are test required again as well. So you've got kind of this broad playing field. And when I said at the beginning that there's more confusion and complexity in this landscape now, that's kind of what I'm talking about. A lot of schools have different policies than one another. So what this means for me, kind of a takeaway summary conclusion for those of you watching this, is having a score is a good way to keep your options open, because maybe you end up wanting to apply to Purdue, but you didn't even know about it when you started this process, right? If you haven't tested, you're kind of behind the eight ball if you decide, oh, actually, I really like Purdue, right? So it's a way of not closing any doors and giving yourself some options down the line. And what I say to a lot of students is, maybe testing doesn't need to be like the focus, the priority, or a big source of stress in your college process, but it's probably worth doing a little bit of this stuff just to kind of see where you land and see where your scores are in relation to the rest of your college profile. And you and your staff at Emerging, Laura, I know, look at that profile in a very holistic way and really look at extracurriculars and who is this student on a really personal level, and what do their essays communicate to the schools, and how the tests fit or not in that whole ecosystem of the college profile is going to be different for each student.
Something you brought up has triggered a huge pain point for me, especially, and that is when to decide and how to decide at each individual school to disclose a score or not.
Yeah.
It has been, I never thought I'd be spending the hours of like analyzing 50%. Okay, it's not quite, it's 45. Should we or shouldn't we? Like, it's painful. And I mean, what is your bottom line on that? And maybe you can explain to parents what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So the pretext for what you're saying is super important for you all to understand. Just because you take the test, just because you have a score, doesn't mean you have to send it to the schools you're applying to, right? So that's why I say, like, let's try it, let's explore, let's see what kind of score you achieve, and then we'll see what we want to do with that score. So I'm sitting here in my home office in Boulder, Colorado. So I sometimes talk about CU Boulder. But let's take a case with like CU Boulder versus, I was just there for my reunion over the weekend, Stanford University, right? Let's say you get a 1350 on the SAT, which if you're watching this, 1350 is a great score. Period. Good. It's a great score, right? However, for Stanford, it's well below the 50th percentile. I think Stanford's 50th, like published 50th percentile, actually 25th percentile score is like a 1540 right now, if I'm remembering correctly. It's bonkers. It's super high. I wouldn't have gotten in if I was applying right now, by the way. So 1350, great score on a national average. But you probably don't submit that to Stanford. Actually, kind of a bad example because Stanford now requires scores. But you guys see what I'm saying. If they were test optional, you maybe don't submit that. For CU, you definitely want to submit that. It's a solid score. It's going to look strong vis-a-vis the application pool at CU Boulder. And so you basically, on an individual level, decide, does this score add value to my profile or not, right? Now you mentioned the 50th percentile, and I'm talking about 25th, et cetera. You can look up the average scores at any college in the country. If you just Google, average SAT, CU Boulder, or something like that, you can pull them up. I'm doing this as we speak. The College Board website, which is collegeboard.org. I might as well share my screen since we're here and we've got the technology to do so. If you go to collegeboard.org, scroll down here to this big future section, And we can look at CU Boulder, admissions. And this is why I said a 1350 is a solid score at CU Boulder. It's in probably like the 60th percentile, meaning 1350, you're scoring better than 60% of the students who apply to CU Boulder, right? If we were to look at Stanford, for example, okay, 1510 was the 25th percentile, overshot it a little bit, but 1350 is quite low for a school like Stanford. So on an individual basis, given your score, you can decide what you want to do with it, right? Now, there are some complicating factors also because COVID made things, as I said earlier, even more confusing, where there's a dynamic because test optional was the prevailing policy, students wouldn't submit their scores um, unless they were really good. And as you can imagine, what that did is drive up these averages. So pretty soon, what we had was students who were scoring really well that still weren't submitting their scores because they thought they were below where they should be for those schools.
Right.
Um, this is actually why a bunch of the Ivy League schools, starting with Dartmouth, went back to requiring scores. Dartmouth had this crazy dynamic where you've got students with like 1500s on the SAT who aren't submitting those scores, and they would have added value to their profile. Um, Another thing you want to consider is where are you coming from? What's your academic background? And how does that score position you vis-a-vis your peers? For example, a bunch of years ago, a few years ago, I worked for I worked with a student in rural Pennsylvania, and he would graduate at the top of his class. He ended up having one of the best SAT scores in his graduating high school class. It wasn't really like an amazing score for most Ivy League schools, but I knew it might have been the single best SAT score in his graduating high school class. He
Mm-hmm.
submitted it. That's a good look for him, right? Um, Whereas, if you know that your score is maybe not as good as other people at your school or your district or wherever you're coming from, you may think twice about it, right? So it depends what the school is looking for, and it depends who you are and where you're coming from to determine whether that score adds value. And I mean, honestly, Laura, you know this too. There's no easy way around this. You do have to kind of crunch it for every school and say, okay, my score is X.
Yeah.
Do I submit it to this school? Do I submit it to this other school?
You're
There's
like
no easy, yeah.
as a consultant, like for me, I mean, yeah, I was in a conversation with a parent. I mean, God bless us all. It was like, okay, it's 50%, but it's really 48%, really
Yeah.
47. Like, do you have a cutoff in your mind that you guide your families? And then I do have some questions from parents, so I want to
Oh,
get to.
awesome. I would say, look, even if it's shy of the 50th percentile a little bit, colleges know what a good score looks like. And frankly, most schools are not going to let you in or keep you out because you're at like the 40th percentile instead of the 50th percentile. The scores, one thing I can say is the score is not going to be the deciding factor in the admissions decision most of the time. And that's one thing that's been highlighted in this test optional world is schools that look at scores still think they add value and they're helpful to consider, but they're not going to be the thing that gets you in or keeps you out, right?
Right.
It's one part, is one more data point. So if your score, my general advice is like if your score is kind of like in the range, probably submit it.
Okay.
If it's a lot lower than they're looking for, maybe not.
Okay. Here's a question: are
Please.
the published ranges misleadingly high in the test
Yes.
optional world? It's a self-selecting subset of people who are actually submitting scores. How do you like? What do we do with that?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was suggesting a minute ago. Yes, the ranges are artificially high,
Yeah.
100%. And that's basically why I just said a second ago, if you're in the range, probably still submit.
Okay.
Um,
That's I
I've
just
had
from
I've
that.
had students with like exceptional scores that were on the fence about submitting over the last couple of years. And look, Stanford's published range is 1510 to 1570, which we just looked at. If you have a 1500, you want to submit that score still. They still know that that's a really good score.
Yeah.
And they're also aware that the 1510 is probably artificially inflated.
Right.
Um, and here's the thing, admissions departments won't tell you this, but If you don't submit your 1,500, they might be sitting there reading your application thinking, this kid didn't submit. Maybe they got a 1,200. I don't know. We don't have any numbers, right?
Yeah, that's another thing I want to address. Let me ask you this one other question, because we're going over a little, which I never do in this podcast, but I have to, because it's so important. Okay, here's one. If you're using the Common App, can schools see whether you submit a score to one school versus another? I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but I'll let you answer it.
No, the answer is no. So the way the Common App works is you will write in your scores on the Common App, right? But you will then, behind the scenes, you send your scores to the colleges that you actually want to see them. So every school sees the entirety of the Common App, but if you choose not to send your scores to certain schools, they don't see them.
Okay. Okay. What about this?
These are good questions, by the way.
What about Georgetown? Like, they get to see all the scores? How?
Georgetown is
that, yeah. And what is that about? And maybe again, give context for the community.
Georgetown is extremely unique. So my wife went there, and they did go test optional for a minute during COVID, but they were the first school to do an about face and go back to requiring tests, right? So Georgetown likes tests, and I think they're one of two now. They're one of two schools in the country that require all of your scores. So if you take the test multiple times, they ask you to send them all. The other one, I believe, if I remember correctly, is Duquesne College, which is in Pittsburgh. So there basically aren't any schools except Georgetown and Duquesne that require all of your scores. So if you take the ACT, say 3 times, Georgetown asks you to send all 3 of those scores. Now, it gets weird because they ask you to send them. Are you actually required to send them? Not really, but Georgetown, I've talked at length to their admissions office about this, actually. They tell me that they have a way to know if you've sent them or not. So with Georgetown, bottom line, send them all your scores. That's what they're asking you to do. That's what you should do.
Okay, that's good. Okay, I think it's hard to not leave without just this whole thing is like, it says test optional. Is it really test optional?
Yeah.
A lot of families and you do start looking at the data after the past 3 years, and it is looking to me like people who do submit scores are getting better admissions results. And that kind of stinks in the context of our one parent who's like, are the published ranges misleadingly high in the test optional world? So any last words on that? And then we will wrap this up.
It's the short answer to a lot of these questions, but it really depends on the individual school. There are some schools that are truly test optional. They really look at students who submit scores and students who don't submit scores the same, and the score is not going to give a leg up to the student in and of itself. There are other schools that put great weight on these scores. One example that comes to mind is Carnegie Mellon, which is a great university. And Carnegie Mellon, on their website, it says, we are test optional, but if you're applying to the computer science program, we really encourage you to submit scores, which to me is a pretty fun, kind of weird and funny example. They're saying, look, we are test optional, but for CS, we really want your scores. Basically, that means like computer science is not really test optional at Carnegie Mellon, right? And so it really depends on the school, but also even sometimes the department. And one thing I would say is STEM programs like test scores. So if you're applying as an engineer, as a math major, as a computer scientist, you probably want to submit scores. Another school that requires test scores is University of Texas at Austin. They were one of the big flagship public schools that went back to requiring scores. But even before they required scores again, we knew that their engineering departments, which are very highly reputed, liked kids to submit scores, right? Mm-hmm. So it really depends on the school. It really depends on the program of study. you can, as a parent or a student, literally just call the admissions office and you don't have to give them your name or anything, but hey, my kid has a 1350 on the SAT. Should we submit it or not? And they will tell you, actually.
Mhm.
So, it is annoying that it's so varied from school to school, but if you do the research, you can come to a pretty good conclusion.
Yeah,
And there are some good data out there. For example, let's see if I have this in a slide. Boston College, a few years ago, there were some data that that showed that Boston College let in students with test scores almost 3 times as often as students without test scores.
right.
That's BC, Boston College. Across town at Northeastern University, also in Boston, it was basically even. There was no preference for kids who submitted scores versus students who did not. So again, it really depends on the school. And one thing you can take away from this talk is it makes our lives as counselors and test prep people and parents harder because it's such a different policy for each student and for each school. But if you do the work and you do the research, you can use that variance between schools and between students to your advantage to say, oh, my kid, should we submit to Northeastern? Should we submit to BC? And you can really get a sense for whether these scores matter and how much they matter and make decisions appropriately.
Yeah. That seems like a great way to end, even though I could ask you 700 more.
Totally.
Think of anyone better to have a conversation about all of this with you. I think you do bring such a holistic approach to a conversation that is very a data driven engagement. Thank you so much, Bill, for your time. And I love our relationship and our partnership over the years and can't wait for the next conversation.
Yeah, absolutely a pleasure, Laura. So fun to talk to you about this stuff. And yeah, thanks for having me. Look forward to the next time.
Okay, see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.